sort. And the lights kicked on, and there were about 20, 25 people sitting around staring at me. And they said, "Do you have the documents?" And I thought, thank God. And I handed them the briefcase, and they proceeded to pour over a series of documents that I had acquired over a period of time. I didn't even acquire them. I acquired a portion of them. Most of them were acquired by the other people in this entourage that were trying to save the hospital and stick with the mission. And it was front page of the Daily News and the New York Post, and front page for about 5 days as the district attorney was getting involved and the scandal was uncovered. And part of the deal was that we weren't allowed to talk about what took place for 10 years and that the people in place were being removed from their positions, and they all were removed. We had subsequently left. We were offered our jobs back, but at that point, I had enough stress in my life. I think after that, I was ready to move on. I had already left the job at that point, so I was already making arrangements to leave. So, but it was one of those life-changing experiences where you're challenged to make very important decisions, and these decisions impact you personally, like your entire career and everything you've worked for. And you know, if you make a bad decision, this could go really badly for yourself. So with so much at stake, you got to go to your inner soul, your inner person, and say to yourself, what's right, what's wrong. Everything your parents taught you, stick to philosophy, stick to what's truthful, what's right. Don't allow yourself to get swayed or misguided, and hopefully, God willing, it turns out well.
You have a very unique veterinary practice. Where did it come from? What is it founded on? What are its principles?
I think the hospital has evolved over time, but it was founded on that initial concept of trying to provide the best possible care and experience for an owner that's under duress, best possible medical care for a patient. And we practice under the philosophy I've always practiced under, which doesn't always work well for some people, because these days it's not always the same work type of ethic that you see from years ago. I hear it frequently. You're a dinosaur. You can't do that anymore. Those days are gone. You can't demand or expect people to perform at their top level anymore. It's sad for me. I've been training and teaching doctors for almost 20 years. And the notion that you can't expect excellence from people or put demands upon people is sad. And you hear it all the time. You can't ask people to do that. Sure you can. And you know, these days it's troubling, and I worry for an entire generation, because I see it in the young folks, just the fundamental arts of communication. So our hospital's built on some principles that were laid upon me by my grandparents and my parents, of communication, of caring for people, of respect, of excellence in what you do. We can do anything for anybody. I tell everyone, before you turn some way, ask me. There's always something we can do for somebody. And it's hard because I know I'm wired a certain way, both because of how I was raised in genetics, and you probably can't put that level of expectation upon everybody. But it can be a philosophy of the hospital. And what I tell people is I never ask you to do anything I haven't done myself. So I never ask you to do something you can't do.
Medically, though, your hospital has gone to some unusual places. In terms of the type of medicine you practice.
Well, as a specialty, there were no specialty hospitals per se when we were kids. You were mostly a veterinarian who took care of animals locally, a family vet, and there were a handful. Mostly universities were specialty hospitals. I certainly never dreamed of being a veterinary brain spine surgeon or hip replacement surgeon. Those things you didn't hear a whole lot about that when I wanted to go be a veterinarian. But I also knew early on I wanted to be something different. You know, if I wanted to be a police officer, I wanted to be a sniper for the police department. I knew if I wanted to be a veterinarian, I wanted to be a specialist, but I wasn't sure what exactly that meant, and that's why I thought maybe I should go to medical school. Am I going to be satisfied professionally being a veterinarian? So I knew if I was going to go that route, I was going to have to take it to another level. I just didn't know what level because it didn't exist at the time. And there are no limits. There really are no limits. Our hospital sees and does things you don't see at many hospitals. We're a very unique place. We get referrals from universities. I get referrals from Cornell University, the place that rejected me. I get referrals from North Carolina State to do hip replacements on cats. I was invited to speak at several national, international conferences to tell them about what we're doing, what we're pioneering at our hospital. And I try to surround myself with people with that kind of energy level, rather than forcing people to do what they don't want to do. I mean, it's okay. You can't have 100 or 180 people of the same. It doesn't work well. You know, somebody told me once, it's like a minestrone soup. You need your potato, you need the carrot, you need the broth, to make the soup, you need components. Not everybody can be the potato or the carrot. So it's okay to have an array of different type of people. But to give the place the energy, you need a certain number of people that are wired the same way to drive them, keep the momentum going, drive the ship. And I
What
think
are
that's
some of these pioneering efforts?
Oh, we have entered several areas. I mean, when you think about imaging, we're the first. When you think about imaging, we're the first veterinary hospital to put in something called a 3 Tesla MRI unit. That's a special MRI unit that is so sophisticated on Long Island. We were the second one. The first one was at Stony Brook Medical School. The second one was at our veterinary hospital. Now, to get access to a $4 million MRI unit, you have to get help. And when I had to get help, I had to turn to Philips and Siemens, the maker of the MRI unit. And I had to dress like my grandmother taught me to dress and talk like my mother taught me to talk to people and make the case as to why they should make available a $4 million MRI unit to a veterinarian on Long Island when none had ever existed. And can you do that? And tell them I can't afford $4 million, but I can do other things for you that may be in your best interest. And would you make this available? And I remember we dressed up the conference room. We ordered special tables with skirts. We have name cards, pitchers of water. I remember what my grandmother said to me, you know, do it, you're going to do it right. And if you want an MRI unit, you want the best. You don't want a good MRI, you want the best MRI. And that's what I was shooting for. And Philips sent a team over from Europe. And they sat in that conference room and I made the case as to why I would be able to sell more MRI units than their best salesman. Because I lecture at human brain surgery conferences. And there's no group more arrogant than a bunch of human brain surgeons. And if they get up and see a veterinary brain surgeon with a 3 Tesla MRI unit and they don't have one, they'll be demanding one at their hospital because the dog guy has one. And that's exactly what happened. I presented at a human conference and you saw the first break, these guys pulling out their Blackberries, getting on the phone going, the dog guy's got a 3 Tesla MRI and we only have a 1.5 and we're the Cleveland Clinic or we're the North Shore. And in fact, North Shore LIJ, the big hospital system on Long Island, was putting in a smaller MRI unit at one of their hospitals at the time we were putting in a 3 Tesla. So it worked. It worked. We made a reasonable presentation. They saw the value and we have it. And we are the only ones in private practice with a 3 Tesla MRI unit producing research and data at human and veterinary conferences. So for me, nothing's more exciting because now I'm sort of professionally creeping into my dad's MD world. So indirectly, I feel like I'm making it back there anyway. We have things like medical infrared imaging, special type of imaging technology that's used in breast cancer in Europe, but not necessarily in the United States because no one's done the research for it. So when I looked into how to do this, the first thing I realized is you got to get trained. Well, the training's at Duke University through another company that works at a Duke. Well, they don't have veterinarians. They only train MDs and DOs. So I had to make the pitch. And I met with this guy in his hotel room, and he granted my resident and I permission to go down there. And we went through the training. We passed the certification, and they granted us status. We're the only 2 veterinarians with certifications in human breast cancer screening for medical infrared imaging. Now we publish paper after paper using this to diagnose conditions in dogs that also can be used to diagnose the same condition in people. So our research benefits people and pets, and that's one of the mottos of our hospital. Pro bono animalem harmonique, for the good of animals and man. That's one of our missions, our vision statement, or mission statement.
You're deeply involved with rescue communities, with service dogs, service animals. Can you tell me a bit about that?
One of our hospital's mission statements is a part of it is community service, and I do quite a bit of that. I do a lot of work with the police departments. My hospital does a lot with community support, so we marry those worlds. We provide service to Guide Dog Foundation, to the various animal rescue groups, Sweetbriar Rescue, the Bronx Zoo, Riverhead Sea and Turtle Rescue, you know, their sea mammal group, So we make that as part of what we do. I think that takes me back to the days at West Hills Day Camp and Saving the Goat, you know. It's nice to do our job, to produce income, to service our clients, but we can broaden that up a bit. So we commit quite a bit of resources to help out with all the different wildlife organizations. We probably have 30 nonprofits that we provide free care to. When it comes to the police departments, that dates back to my days at the Animal Medical Center. So I used to work with the different police departments in animal abuse cases and developed a relationship with the law enforcement community. And then eventually through 9/11, it grew into quite an endeavor where we serviced the police dogs for the city, Nassau County, Suffolk County, Nassau County Corrections, the MTA, the Secret Service, the TSA, the Federal Air Marshals. And so we handle almost 200 different police dogs, and we're on 24-hour call, and I'm their surgeon for that. I make their decisions as to who handles what, and that grew out of really what took place at 9/11.
Talk to me about 9/11.
Well, the 9/11 experience, I was on Long Island when 9/11 occurred. I think everyone probably remembers the day and time when they heard about this. I happened to be on the road heading into work, coming from a meeting when I heard the first reports of 9/11. And originally we thought it was just I think it was originally reported as maybe a civilian airplane accidentally hitting the building, but soon after we realized what was going on, at least at our hospital. I started getting calls from police contacts, but there was no foreseen role for canine units down there. No one discussed veterinary services at 9/11. It was far remote. No one ever envisioned the buildings coming down. So it wasn't really a rescue operation. It was more about an evacuation plan. That evening, my wife being 8 months pregnant, I remember getting a call from Police Plaza actually the following morning, early hours of the next morning, saying this has turned into a massive rescue operation as the building has come down. And of course I had watched it. I had talked to some colleagues of mine that were in Brooklyn that saw things come down, but I still didn't envision this being a rescue operation until I got that call. I actually called back to verify it was a valid call. I honestly doubted it so much. I called back Police Plaza through my contacts to see, and they said it's real. I called up my hospital and I said, I told Brian to get the supplies ready. We're going down there. I remember Jackie's looking at me, not knowing what's going on. They told me on the phone, there's no access. The military's shut down all access to the city. All airports are down. We're going to send a police escort. We pulled off one of the congressmen, and we're going to send them down there. So I put on a pair of scrubs. I put on some work boots, not knowing what I was going to be down there. And I said to Jackie, I'll be back later on. I'm going down there to assess the situation and come up with a medical plan for the canine unit. I came back a couple days later, so I didn't know what I was walking into. They called me back and said that we got your police escort, but he's only going to be able to travel you halfway. I said, well, what good is that? They said, he goes, Dominic, I know you. He said, when you get to the military, talk your way in. And I didn't know what that meant. I thought it was a pretty funny comment. I said, you got to be kidding me. So I picked up Brian, and off we went at a good 90-mile-an-hour clip, car loaded with supplies. And sure enough, there's the United States Army with their M16s out blocking the way. And, I have some badges and a few things, identification, and we make our way down there. But as we crossed over, it was devastating. Crossing over the bridge, you could start to smell the smoke. You knew something was up. And we donned masks as we crossed into Manhattan because you could tell the breathing was getting difficult. By the time we got down there, it was just the Wild West. I mean, the buildings had come down. It was still on fire. The air quality was just brutal. You couldn't see anything. You couldn't see anything. I have pictures from when I was down there. And the initial 24 hours, you couldn't see a thing. I parked my car literally in front of the pile. I mean, just drove right up to it. You just flashed a badge, drove your car up, shut the engine off, and said, this looks like we're going to set up right here. It was on the West End Highway. Right, and it was on the intersection of Vesey Street. There's a picture of Brian and I standing there. We walked around, you couldn't breathe. We literally had OR masks on, but those were inconsequential. So the guys from Naval Intelligence came over. Everyone was meandering around. I had high school classmates that were in the NYPD. I had high school classmates that worked in that building. So the guys from Naval Intelligence came over to us and said that the air quality is dangerous and you guys need to put on these respirators and don't take them off the entire time you're down here, and put on these goggles. So we slapped on the masks and the goggles, but of course it's hard to eat and drink like that, so you had to take them off. All the food being served was covered in soot. I mean, we walk around with trays of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with white powder on them. So I told Brian, don't eat anything that wasn't in a wrapper because this stuff is bad news. I knew asbestos was an issue, but I didn't know about all the other issues. Brian and I started the process of following the canine units into the pile, trying to figure out where we're going to set up a triage center. The pile's 5 stories high, so it's just inconceivable. As we walked around, literally there were, I remember a few blocks away from the actual ground zero point, there was a desk and a chair. We opened up the desk and it was someone's car keys, their ID, all the personal effects of someone who actually had been sitting at the desk moments before. Literally her ID and her purse was in there. So it started getting real at that moment. We realized this is more than just buildings, these are people. Although we couldn't find anybody, and that was striking. We were set up opposite the morgue. The morgue was all set up with body bags ready to go. Couldn't find any bodies. We were walking around the pile that first night, and we have lights on our hats. We have lights were flashing, and we kept hearing crash. I mean, explosions in the pitch black. And Brian and I are searching around. The pile glowed at night. It was red from the fire still burning. And you had to watch. You would drop in a crevasse. If you weren't walking correctly, you might drop into a hole. So there's a danger looking up and looking down. We didn't know what those crashes were. And finally, some ESU guys came over and said, those are sections of the building falling off at night, smashing on the ground. You guys got to get out of here. Because at any moment, one of them could crush you. You wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even know. And I just looked at Brian wearing these plastic hats saying, this is beyond what we need to be doing. We got to get out of this area because we didn't know what the next hit would hold. So we evacuated that area. And we would sleep in a cardboard box. Literally, there were cardboard boxes. We crawled in there. The vehicle was full of supplies, and we just took turns taking a nap in a box and treating dogs that were getting hurt coming in and out. By the next day, we were out there walking around, and there were surveyors out there watching the building, making sure it wouldn't tip on us because there were segments still standing. And I remember most vividly the firemen that were lined up, walking in one after the other like ants, following each other. And I'm 6'2", I'm 6'1", I'm a big guy. These guys were enormous. These guys were enormous compared to me. Marching in with their axes and their pry bars. And we're all walking around the pile. Everyone stopped for a few minutes if you heard something, and then you'd listen for a tap. At one point, we rescued 4 guys, but they were rescuers that fell in a hole. We thought they were trap victims. They're actually guys who fell in and had to be pulled out. But at one moment, there was a whistle blown from one of the surveys that one of the buildings was about to fall to evacuate, and everyone fled. Brian fled, I fled, we fled in different directions. We lost track of each other. And I'm running, and he's running, and we couldn't, I realized I couldn't clear this thing. I saw what was about to come down, I couldn't clear it as it started to tip. And I remember this cop fell as we ran as fast as you could run. I mean, you don't see people in uniform run like that, ever. You watch firemen throw their axes on the ground and run, you know something's up. This cop fell on his face, and someone picked him up, and his uniform was cut. He was cut, and just run. And I ran into an alcove, realizing I could not run it. I was in there with a cop, and there was a priest in there, and he ended up giving us last rites right there. And he said, and that moment, I knew this was serious. I mean, the whole thing was surreal, but when the priest is, I've never got last rites in my life. Then I got last rites. The whistle blew. We came back, and Brian found me again. We lost track of each other about 30 minutes, and I told him what happened. He was like, it was getting intense, you know, and this went on day after day. And after the federal response came in with some veterinarians, some support, because for the first 24 hours it was pretty anemic. There wasn't a whole lot of help. After the second day, help arrived from the local rescue groups. And by the third day, the federal response came in, and we kind of turned things over and said, this is what we did. This is a triage center. This is the program we set up. These are the dogs that are on site. And we ended up getting out of there. I got a call that first night from my friend Lance, who said, you know, cell phone service was really sketchy. And Lance's brother-in-law was in the buildings, and he was under the impression he was going to be rescued. So he said, Nick, man, my brother was there. He was in the 90-something floor, you know, keep an eye out for him. And I said, Lance, I remember telling him, I said, I don't see anyone coming out of this. And that was like the first conversation I had about with someone from the outside. So after that, it was a series of funerals with empty caskets. I went to his brother-in-law's funeral. They just stopped looking after a while. And we lost a high school classmate in there, but many of my high school classmates were there: Kevin Devine, Steve Alou, John Nicholson. So there's a little bit of camaraderie of those of us that went to Holy Family, who were there looking for guys who went to Holy Family, and Brian McKenna's experience down there. We kind of talk about it periodically. I've been down there a couple times. I run past it when I run the New York City Marathon. We run past it, right down West Side Avenue, right down Vesey Street. We cross right over where I stood. So it's a very different experience for me than it is for someone like my wife or the others. You come home, you look at it on TV, and you realize it's way too sterile. Having been there and choked on the jet fuel and had the smog in your eyes and going to eye wash stations to rinse your eyes, and then you see it on TV and it's way too pasteurized. It's all cleansed up nicely. Makes you rethink a lot of things about bomb this and bomb that. I think about that. There was only 2 buildings that came down, and I saw what it did. It looked like a nuclear explosion. Could you imagine what Baghdad must have looked like dropping all those bombs on there? So really changes you when you look at things like that. And 3,000 people.
You went back to Italy.
Yeah, I took an amazing trip back to Italy.
Tell me about that trip.
It was, you know, I had the idea of taking a trip back to Italy because my grandfather really didn't get a chance to go back as often as he wanted. Almost rarely did he make it back to Sicily. I'm not even sure he made it back but one time or twice in his life from leaving. I knew he accomplished a lot there. I knew he gave up everything for a principle, and he never got to show it off. He talked about it, but he never got to show his son. I'm not even sure he showed Uncle Nino what he showed, and me, his grandson, his namesake. So again, one of these kooky ideas I had, like, let me take Grandpa to Alabama. And so we came up with this idea of taking Grandpa, who was pretty old at the time. I wish I could remember his exact age, but I'm thinking it was in the 90s. And my dad and Uncle Nino and myself, and let's go to Sicily and find the relatives. And it was amazing. It was absolutely extraordinary. So we showed up in the town where he was born, and we just parked ourselves right in the middle of the piazza. And it only took a few moments when people started coming out of the woodwork saying, the Americans here, Americana. People knew. We went to my mother's hometown. We didn't just go to my dad's hometown. We went to my mother's hometown too, with the same style. Park ourselves in the piazza and let it happen. And out of the woodwork they came. And he became a celebrity because he was a walking history book. He was like unfrozen caveman. He had been frozen from whatever year he left, maybe 1920s or 30s, and that was his memory, and that was it. So here he is, 1,000,000 years later, and these people are going. These weren't the people that knew him. His generation long since died, and their parents, some of them had died. This was the grandkids of his generation and the kids of his generation. So they were blown away. And we couldn't get near him. There was a crowd formed around him. And I looked at my dad and he said, here, give him some money and give him here's some euro to buy coffee. And he couldn't spend money in that town. And we went off to the cemetery like good Italians do. You show up in Sicily, you got to go to the cemetery and look at the relatives and pay respect. So we meandered around the town. We went to the historical society, and Grandpa was mobbed by people. And Grandpa, as a straight shooter as he is, would say, I remember your father. He was a crook. He used to steal things from me. And the kid would burst out laughing. And I knew your father. He was a good guy. And he pretty much told everyone about their family, what they were like 1,000,000 years ago. It went on forever. It was amazing. And then we traveled to... we went to Italy, we went to Rome and looked there. We went to the military museum where Grandpa was celebrated there as an artillery guy. We found the actual weapon he used to fire. We found the town where his father was killed. I mean, his father and his uncle were drafted out of a small town in Sicily, sent to the Austrian front, and unfortunately not resupplied. The Italians spread thin, and they took these young farm boys and they abandoned them, and they starved to death in a horrible circumstance, and a monument was built in their name, and a monument was built in his town. So there in his town is an obelisk with the name of his grandfather, Leonardo, and his brother, and I climbed it at his request with a pencil and a paper and shadowed the name for him. And he was incredibly, as he said, disgusted. He just had his father's life was squandered in such a careless way, and he'll never forget it. That's why he's not a big war guy. He was never big about joking about the mafia and never big about joking about war. When The Godfather came out and all those movies came out, he was not a funny topic for him on any level. The mafia cost him his existence in Sicily. He didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want to see it romanticized. He thought they were sons of bitches, as he would say. They wrecked his life and they wrecked other people's lives. So he was a very serious guy in those capacities. War was not something, you didn't say go to war in front of Grandpa. He knew what war meant. It cost him his father. So a lot of those experiences. We found his farms. He couldn't wait. He walked through farm after farm and he showed me the fields he plowed, and he said my uncle and I would sleep overnight after we'd walk to the farm, and then we'd work all day and we'd walk home. He said, and that sometimes we'd sleep in that hut if the weather was bad. He said, he showed me branches on the trees that he grafted, and these would grow oranges and these would grow lemons. He grafted different fruits. So he was able to find all that stuff. He was so proud to show me this was his town, this was his country, and he got to brag for a week, and he was in his glory. He was in his glory. We found all the relatives that were there. Our cousins are still there. He was very disappointed in some regards. He said, this is, where are all the horses? I remember that. He looked at the relatives and said, where are all the horses? And they said they'd been replaced by tractors. And he shook his head. A tractor could never do what a horse could do. A horse was your friend, your companion. A tractor's a machine. So there was some disappointment for him, the realization. And he was, they didn't keep the farm up as well as he did. They didn't, there's a little bit of that. But it was comical. It was comical.
50 or 60 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you always remember things a little differently. So it was a walk through history.
Is that the only trip you've made, or have you been?
I go to Italy as much as I can squander for as much as I can get my hands on through lecturing and things like that. But that was the big trip with Grandpa. We saw La Matrice, the Chiesa, the church in town where he was married.
Santa Margherita.
The Santa Margherita. Yeah. That was amazing. I have a picture here in front of it. We found the town where my father was. Well, not the town, the house he was born, that was demolished in the earthquake. So we stood in the doorway. We stood in the kitchen where he was born. We walked that walk. We went to Grandma Rapisardi. These stories come alive when Grandma Rapisardi talks about how she went from America to Italy to see the man she's going to marry, who she didn't know, and met him for a few hours and then walked. She said, I sat in that apartment building. I looked down the block at the church and I thought to myself, am I really going to do this? My grandmother told me that.
She was American and
she was living in America
and went back to Sicily
to marry Grandpa and then to have a honeymoon and come back to America with him.
What a brave woman.
And she said to me, I sat there and I looked down that block and everyone was lined up and it was ready to happen, and I thought to myself, am I really going to do it? She told me about the fear, the genuine fear. So when I went to her town, I made a point. I knocked on someone's door and said, can I come in? And I stood in the doorway where my grandmother stood and looked exactly. I have the picture of her wedding, of Grandpa and her standing. I stood in her step and I walked her walk, her wedding walk. I looked at the view and I could remember her words. I was terrified, she said. And I walked right down there and we stood right where Grandpa and Grandma posed for their wedding picture. It's all there, the bronze gate, everything. The Iron Gate, I should say. So it was incredible for me to walk the steps of my family stories I heard since I was a kid. The theater, I want to say Bellini, but I'm not sure. The theater in Grandpa, there's this, the only theater in the town. It began with a B, and I think it was Bellini. Theater, and we stood there where that was. Been there for God knows how long. That's where the shows began. So all their stories came alive for me.
You're going to take your kids?
I will. One of the most profound stories, we went to the historian, and we went to the cemetery, and they opened up the books, and they were to find Salvatore. Her father died while in Europe, and he was buried there, and she never saw him again. So we went to the cemetery, and there we found, and they're dusting off books. I actually videoed this. They're dusting off the books. These books haven't been opened in a long time, and he's buried in a crypt. And this crypt hasn't been opened in, I think, 50 years. They said they had to break the lock and pry the door open. And in there are these, it's for men only, men from the society were buried in here. And there he is, and they have those little porcelain pictures, and there he is on the wall. And we found his crypt, and the face, you see the face of our relatives in there. You see the face of my daughters in there. We found in the book Rose Costa, who's never talked about in our family. Rose Costa is their first baby who died, and they named my grandmother after her. She's really the second Rose Costa. And this baby died as an infant, and they created a tombstone that Grandpa carved an angel on. And it's unmarked, doesn't have her name on it. It's just carved as an angel. It's always been described to me. No one's seen it because there's no headstone on it. And we found the mark and we walked the correct number of paces. It's unmarked, so you had to find it the old-fashioned way, paces this way. And there it was under a tree. And it's a baby's casket carved with an angel. It's the one he made for her. It was Rose. It's my grandmother's oldest sister that died. And we found it. And she had always talked about it and never saw it. It was her thing, you know. That was something she never saw, and I found it for her. Oh, we got married in 95, and then Grace was our first baby in 97. When we got the news that Jackie was pregnant with Grace, it was exciting because we knew this was the phase of life we looked forward to hitting. You know, we wanted to move into this, and I always had this thought in my head that, and I had talked to Jackie about it before we got married, that the firstborn son was going to be named Leonardo, right? Because I'm not sure everyone would buy into that. So we talked about that in advance, and I think Jackie was just thrilled when it was a baby girl. Because I'm not sure she was as thrilled about the name Leonardo after my father and his grandfather, but Gracie was a blessing. So the news of Grace's arrival was well received, and she was the first pancake, as we say. We joke around going, Grace was the first pancake. We didn't know what we were doing. There was no instruction manual. Everything was brand new, and there was a lot to learn with Grace.
Tell me how you felt, though, when you found out that you were going to be a father.
Well, for me, it was about family. It was an expected next phase of life. You know, we were getting to the point where it was time to have a family, and it was scary because my dad, the family had always been our family, in my eyes. You know, it was always the family, and now all of a sudden I was going to have a family of our own, an offshoot family. So it was a little bit scary to think about that, and the responsibility that went along with it. All the things you worry about when you find out you're having a baby. Is everything going to be okay? Are they going to be healthy? What are they going to be like when they get older? And who's supposed to take care of them?
And when Gracie was born, how'd you feel?
Gracie came out the size of a 3-month-old. So when that baby came out, the first thing I heard the doctor say is, "Here she comes." Oh, she's still coming out, and she was big. She grew up. She came out, instead of newborn clothes, she went right into 3-month-old clothes. So she came out enormous. And we joke, because when I see normal babies, when people have a baby, I've never seen a baby so small, because we had a 3-month-old. And I remember seeing her first in the nursery. The next time I saw her, first time was when she first came out. But when she's all cleaned up in the nursery, laying there, I'm staring through the window looking for my kid, and there's the one labeled Baby Grace. And some little boy sitting next to me looks over and goes, "Is that your kid, mister?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "She sure is a pork chop." And I said, "She is, isn't she?" And that was my baby girl, the pork chop. We actually joke about it with Grace because she came out quite sizable, and she was a happy baby and the first baby, and it was a thrill for my parents, absolutely. You know, it was an endeavor. Since it was the first baby, we made multiple trips to the hospital. I wouldn't say on for Jackie's sake, it was the smoothest scenario. We went there, were sent away. We went there, were sent away. We kept getting sent away, being told, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." And then they missed some window for an epidural, so poor Jackie had to deal with the pain management scenario by biting a stick as opposed to chemically. So that was kind of difficult. So by the time Gracie drug out the labor process as long as possible, Jackie, without the benefit of the modern day pain medicine, had the baby the old-fashioned way, biting a stick. And she was exhausted by the time the baby came out. And it dragged on quite a bit. So it went on for a long time. And by the time she came out, I think we were all wiped out. So I made all the phone calls to let the family know the new baby arrived, and she was healthy, Baby Grace. I remember Jackie said, "Why don't you go home and you got to feed the dogs and do a bunch of stuff and relax and then come back and visit." And I did. I actually said, "Hey, Pop, would you mind feeding the dogs?" And he said, "No problem at all." And I called Brian. I said, He said, we got a paralyzed dog. He said, I'll get her down for you. And I quickly ran over and did a spine surgery real quick, and then took a shower at home, got dressed and came back. And Jackie said, did you get some sleep? I said, sure. It's fantastic. And then we just got that baby home, and everything was about the baby. The whole world changes. Everything's upside down. Everything's circular. It's like running a critical care center for a living creature that can't sustain itself. So it was 24-hour critical care for the next several months.
The way she changed your life, is it what you anticipated?
Oh, probably not. I don't think anyone anticipates correctly. You hear all the stories about this, that, the other thing, but it is life-changing in a very dramatic way, more than just colorful fairy tale books. I mean, it's literally, as a medically trained person, as Jackie will tell you, it's like running a critical care center. You know, we hear all these, probably because you know too much. I think if you weren't medically trained, you could write off a lot more. But every inspiration is a potential airway obstruction. Everything they do, you're staring at from a medical perspective. It probably made it more